Hello everyone, and it's time to review the last batch of cards for Darkness Evolved. Now listen, I know this video is late, but I tried to record it yesterday for over an hour. Before I looked down and realized my microphone was turned off. So, we're going to take this from the top again. So I realize the patch will be up already and you'll be playing with new cards by the time this gets out. In fact, the game's updating right now, which is why we're listening to the lovely title screen music instead of the menu music, because that's all that I can capture right now. But anyway, let's get started. We have a lot of cards to go over. On the plus side, a lot of these cards are just bronze cards with very basic effects, so I'm just going to skim over anything like that. That doesn't mean they're bad cards, it just means that it's not really worth talking about. Like, for example, a 2-mana spell, restore 2 defense to your leader and draw a card. It's a very obvious card that you would use to fill out a deck where you want that effect in it. There are also a lot of trade-off cards that are very similar to existing cards that have a pro and a con or something like that. You can use it in place of that card, or you can use it in addition to that card if you want more of that similar effect. And there are also some vanilla cards and whatnot, so we're just going to skim over those. If they are particularly good or bad, then I'll stop and talk about them, but otherwise we're just going to keep moving along. Try to save time. One quick correction though, in the last episode I said that Humpty Dumpty would survive when you evolve him. The text does say destroy all followers, not all other followers, so he does die in the AoE, but that doesn't make him a bad card. I actually thought him surviving the AoE was really strong, so now he's just regular strong. Still a pretty good card. Anyway, moving along. First up, a Blood Crab. Precious Blood Fangs, 1-mana spell, summon X forest bats and deal X damage to your leader. X equals the number of enemy followers in play. Kind of a trade-off card with Summon Bloodkin. It's less money, you can potentially summon more bats, but you do deal damage to yourself, and you're not always going to consistently get those 2 bats. Good card for bat decks. Next up, Medusa's Gaze, 2-mana. Kind of weird card text here. Give an allied follower the same ability as Medusa until the end of the turn. Medusa's effect is, when attacking an enemy follower, destroy the enemy follower before it can deal any damage in return. But it's kind of weird how it just says the same ability as Medusa instead of putting the ability right there. I'm sure in game you'll be able to click Medusa and read her ability, but it's just kind of awkward. As for the effect, Medusa herself doesn't really see play, mostly because she's a slow card. They get to kill her before she gets to do anything, and she also has poor stat distribution. I believe she's a 5/4. She's also understated by 2 stat points, which is an equivalent of 1 mana. So you're paying 1 extra mana for this card, but you get to put it on any minion you have with good stat distribution, and it's likely to be ready to attack if you're going to put the buff on it, obviously. It can be good in certain situations, but typically you want cards that you can always play in your hand. So that puts this a little on the weak side. Labyrinth Devil, 4-mana 3/4. It has an evolve effect of destroy an enemy follower if Vengeance is active for you. Pretty powerful effect, but a double condition. You need Vengeance and an evolve point. It's not bad if you want a little more removal in your deck, but you're not going to want to rely only on this card. Frenzied Juggernaut, 7-mana 7/8. Fanfare, deal 4 damage to your leader, deal 0 damage instead if Vengeance is active for you. So this is basically a vanilla minion that may or may not damage you. Has good stats for its cost. It's basically an 8-mana minion. If you're not in Vengeance, you're going to pay 4 damage to your face for that 1-mana discount. Other than that, not really much to say about it. Demonic Hedonist, 2-mana 2/2. Fanfare, gain +1/+0 and drain if an evolved allied follower is in play. So we got another basic evolved allied follower in play mechanic. Serpent Charmer, 2-mana 3/2. Last words, deal 2 damage to your leader. So again, you basically get a 1-mana discount on this card. But the difference between 2-mana cards and 3-mana cards is usually only about 1 stat. And to pay for that, you take 2 damage to your leader, which isn't really a negative for Bloodcraft. Sometimes you really want to be in Vengeance and you just can't activate it. Vampiric Kiss, 2-mana spell, deal 2 damage to an enemy follower, restore 2 defense to your leader. So basic 2-mana removal with a benefit. Soul Navigator, 5 mana 3/5. At the end of your turn, deal 1 damage to your leader and summon a forest bat. so you lose 1 stat on the main body, but you gain a 1/1, so you're up by 1 stat right away. And synergize with Bat Dex, obviously. Good card. Demonic Thrall, 6 mana 5/6, Fanfare, gain +2/+2 if Vengeance is active for you. Another basically vanilla minion that gains a buff if you're in Vengeance. Moving on to Dragoncraft, Dragonute Fist. Randomly discard one of the lowest cost cards in your hand. Deal 2 damage to a random enemy follower 2 times. So this is a randomly discard one of the lowest cost cards in your hand mechanic that doesn't actually allow you to draw a card. Siegfried, 4 mana 3/3, Fanfare, destroy a damaged enemy follower. What? Fanfare? Destroy a damaged enemy follower? Pretty sure this should be an evolve effect. This is pretty ridiculous. Wild Hunt is a card that's played for 2 mana, destroy a damaged enemy follower. This one has legs on it, so you're basically paying 2 mana for a 3/3. If you're running Wild Hunt already, you just trade it 1 for 1 with this card. If you're not, you might still put it in your deck just for extra removal anyway. Fanfare, destroy a damaged enemy follower. Why does Dragoncraft get all the good toys? Transmogrified Worm, 5 mana 4/5, evolve, transform an allied follower into a dragon if Overload is active for you. If Overflow is active, you're on turn 7, so it's still possible for you to have an evolve point left, especially in Dragoncraft, but you might have ramped 1 or 2 extra mana, so it could be like turn 5 or 6 when you play this card with 7 mana. So you could play like Ivory Dragon, draw a card, then play this, evolve it, and then you get a 5/5 and a 4/5. It's a cute combo. It has a lot of potential in a ramp deck. If you're not running ramp though, it's probably just going to be about average. You're going to have to play it later, you might not have cards to combo with it. Wild Fang Dragonute, 2 mana 2/2, whenever you discard a card from your hand, deal 1 damage to the enemy leader. Another basic discard Dragoncraft minion. Does a little extra face damage, not a huge deal. Just an average 2/2 with a minor effect. Mushusu, 2 mana 2/2, whenever another follower evolves, gain +2/+0. Another basic follower evolves mechanic card. Iron Scale Dragonfolk, 3 mana 2/3, Fanfare, deal 2 damage to an enemy follower if an evolved allied follower is in play. Another if an evolved allied follower is in play mechanic cards. Little easier to combo with Dragoncraft if you're ramping, but other than that, not much to say about it. Dragon Council, 4 mana spell, randomly discard one of the lowest cost cards in your hand, draw 3 cards. This one I think is a little too slow for discard Dragoncraft. I mean, the whole gimmick is that you're drawing extra cards anyway, so slowing down to spend 4 mana just to cycle 2 cards and draw another card, plus whatever mechanics you have to draw extra cards. It just seems like overkill. In a regular Dragoncraft deck, you probably wouldn't want to slow down just to cycle 2 cards and draw a card either, unless you're playing like a combo deck and you really need to cycle your deck as fast as possible. So basically it's probably a little too slow for any deck that's not running combos. And Dragoncraft doesn't really have combos at this time. They mostly just hit you with storm minions over and over again, or play Satan. Next, Queen's Serpent, 5 mana 4/4. Fanfare, summon a Megalorca if Overflow is active for you. So you get a 4/4 and a 2/2. 6/6 over 2 bodies isn't bad for 5 mana. Plus if you're running Neptune, you get the Megalorca synergy if you can evolve her. Not a bad card, but wait until you see Island Whale, 6 mana 5/7. This may seem like a vanilla minion, but it is very essential. Play your 5 mana Queen Serpent, your 6 mana Island Whale, and then your 7 mana Neptune, and it's the perfect curve for Fishcraft decks. Every Fishcraft deck you see on ladder is definitely going to be running this, trust me. On to Forestcraft, Grand Archer Selwyn, another hero made card. 6 mana 4/6, Fanfare, choose an enemy follower. It can't attack next turn. If that follower has 3 attack or less, return it to the opponent's hand instead. So it basically combines 2 standard Forestcraft tricks into 1 card as a Fanfare ability. Not bad. You do pay 1 stat for the effect though. Elven Archery, 3 mana spell, deal 1 damage to a random enemy follower, X times, X equals the number of cards played this turn, including this card. So this is a trade-off card with Archer, obviously. On the minus side, you don't get a body, And on the plus side, you get 1 ping for every card played this turn instead of just minions being summoned. Also, this card has to be played after your cards, whereas Archer has to be played before your cards, which isn't really a plus or minus, just a slight difference in how you play it. Master of the Canapes, 6 mana 9/9, seems pretty fair. I mean, if you want to get technical, it's a 1/1 fanfare, gain +1/+1 for each card in your hand, but this is Forest Craft. When does Forest Craft not have a full hand? If mid-range Forest Craft does come around, they're probably going to have a slower early game, and they're going to hold on to their combo cards for specific combos instead of throwing them out there for more aggressive combos. So they'll have a decent sized hand. This is going to be a pretty big minion when it hits the board. It comes in during the Evolve Wars. It's a huge minion. It's going to have great trading value. Pretty good card. Dwarf Perfumer, 2 mana 3/1. Fanfare, if an evolved allied follower is in play, choose an enemy follower, it can't attack next turn. Another small effect attached to the if an evolved allied follower is in play mechanic. Glimmering Wings, 2 mana spell, draw a card. If at least 2 other cards were played this turn, draw 2 instead. Another basic card, basically conscription with a Forest Craft mechanic attached. Elf Healer, 3 mana 1/4. Whenever an allied follower comes into play, restore 1 defense to your leader. Very basic effect that can give you a little extra healing if you want it. Underbrush Beast Girl, 4 mana 4/3. Fanfare, gain ambush if at least 2 other cards were played this turn. So you're going to be playing this a little bit later, like turn 6 or so if you want the effect. And a 3 health minion on turn 6 with ambush, and probably like a couple 1/1 fairies. It's going to be pretty susceptible to AoE. It's on the weak side. Verdant Steward, 5 mana 3/5, ward. Last words, put 2 fairies in your hand. This is a trade-off card with Ancient Elf, a 3 mana ward that gives +1/+1 for each minion that gets returned to your hand, which on turn 5 is typically 2 fairies, which makes it a 5 mana 4/5. So this is a little bit worse than an on-curve 5 mana Ancient Elf, but it does put 2 new fairies in your hand, whereas Ancient Elf puts 2 old ones in your hand. Kind of a weird trade-off, but in the later game Ancient Elf can be better, whereas this card will always be a 3/5. But we are comparing a bronze to a legendary, so despite the rarity difference, they're fairly close. If you don't have Ancient Elf, you can easily run this card instead. On to Havencraft. Kaguya, 6 mana 5/6. Last words, summon an Ephemeral Moon. An Ephemeral Moon is a 6 mana amulet, countdown 3. At the end of your turn, randomly change the attack of one of the strongest enemy followers in play to 1. This is a pretty evil effect. For 3 turns you can completely neuter 3 of your opponent's biggest minions on the board. That's pretty good, especially in Havencraft, which is all about stalling. And Kaguya herself is perfectly on power curve, stat-wise, making this a pretty good card for any Havencraft deck that wants to stall in the mid-game. Overall, seems like a great card. We have Winged Sentinel Garda, another leader-made card, 6 mana 4/4. Fanfare, subtract 3 from the countdown of an allied amulet. Deal 3 damage to the enemy leader. Definitely don't combo this with Ephemeral Moon. Subtract 3 will pop pretty much any amulet, but most amulets you usually have like countdown 1 or 2, especially since this comes in the turn after the amulet hit the board, so it already counted down by 1. But on the plus side, he is the first 6 mana card that reduces countdowns, so if you absolutely need as much countdown reduction as you can, I guess you can include him for that reason as well. About an average card. Average to slightly below average maybe. The extra 3 damage to the enemy leader isn't going to really matter at all. Beast Call Aria, a 2 mana amulet, countdown 3, last word summon a Holy Falcon and a Holy Flame Tiger. Don't confuse this with Regal Falcon, this is the cheaper 2/1 Storm Falcon. And Holy Flame Tiger, the 4/4, basically rolls 2 amulets into 1. It costs the same as the Holy Flame Tiger amulet, but the countdown is higher, so it's a trade-off again. And typically, especially on early turns like turn 2, you want those low countdown amulets, so you definitely want to run this in a high countdown reduction deck. Radiance Angel, 5 mana 2/4. Fanfare, restore 3 defense to your leader, draw a card. 2 pretty good effects, and it does pay for it in stats, being 3 stats below power curve. But those are pretty good effects, and on turn 5 you can evolve it, and it has a good stat distribution for trading. This will typically survive something it kills. Overall, pretty good card. God's Steel Wings, 2 mana amulet, countdown 4. Whenever an allied follower evolves, subtract 1 from this amulet's countdown. Last words, summon an Adamantium bird. And the Adamantium bird is a 5 mana 3/5 with Rush. Pretty good minion for a 2 mana amulet. This is another when an allied follower evolves card, but it is also a countdown amulet, so you can reduce the countdown manually, and the when an allied follower evolves is just a small bonus. Monastic Holy Water, 2 mana spell, restore 2 defense to leader or an allied follower, draw a card. Another very basic card. Heavenly Hound, 2 mana 2/2, Fanfare, gain +0/+2 in ward if an evolved allied follower is in play. Another basic evolved allied follower card. Holy Fox Grimwad, 4 mana 3/4, can't be targeted by enemy spells and effects. So it's on the power curve with a slight benefit, but it is a 4 mana card, which is a very competitive slot. You're going to have a hard time fitting this into a deck when you have a lot better cards to play. Comparing this to Priest of the Cudgel is no contest. Pinion Prince, 5 mana 4/5, Fanfare, subtract 1 from the countdown of an allied amulet. This is a trade-off card with Greater Priestess. It has better stats, but it only subtracts from 1 amulet rather than all your amulets. Not much else to say about it. If you're running a lot of amulets, you probably want Greater Priestess. If you're only running a few, Pinion Prince is better. On to Runecraft, Time-Worn Mage Levy, 2 mana 2/2, evolve, put a Crimson Sorcery into your hand. Crimson Sorcery being a 1 mana spell, deal 3 damage to an enemy, which is pretty good. The only real problem is that you obviously don't put 2 mana cards into your deck expecting to evolve them. And on curve, Rune has better 2 mana minions to play, regardless of which deck type you're playing. So this card isn't likely to see play, unless some weird combo comes out in the future. Calamitous Curse, 6 mana spell, banish all enemy followers with 2 defense or less. Earthright, banish all enemy followers with 5 defense or less instead. So the first half of this card has the same downsides as the Havencraft card I mentioned earlier. Binary AoEs really suck because you typically want them to do damage to the entire board. Leaving it unharmed on the board is a lot worse than leaving it damaged on the board. This one does get upgraded with Earthright though, and 5 defense is a lot better than 2 defense. It's hard to say whether or not it'll see play, but this one is a lot better than the Havencraft one. Shadow Witch, 6 mana 5/5. Earthright, transform an enemy follower or amulet into a clay golem. It's petrification with legs, although it does require an Earthright just to get the basic effect off, whereas petrification changes something into a clay golem and worth an Earthright it'll banish it instead. But regardless, changing something very dangerous into a vanilla 2/2 is pretty good, and you only pay for it with 1 stat and an Earth Sigil. Pretty good card. Multi-Part Experiment, 7 mana spell, summon 1 clay golem, spell boost, summon 1 more. So it's basically an upgraded summon snow. Not much to say about it, except it seems pretty expensive for what it does. Path to Purgatory Rune does like a lot of tokens to create shadows, but they typically prefer the Guardian Golems because it does slow down the opponent a lot, which they need in order to stall the game out until they get those shadows, so it's probably not going to work in that deck. Scrap Iron Smelter, 1 mana Earth Sigil, Fanfare, summon a Scrap Golem, Scrap Golem being a 1 mana 0/2 as a ward, a very basic Earth Sigil. Red Hot Ritual, a 2 mana Earth Sigil, Fanfare, deal 2 damage to an enemy follower, another basic Earth Sigil, Sigil, I think it's pronounced Sigil. Witchette Emilu, 3 mana 2/2, subtract 0 from the cost of this card, spell boost, subtract 1 more. It's a teeny tiny flame destroyer and it's cute. I guess if you're all about free minions, you can include this, and since Runecraft always starts with turn 1 insight, it's still a 2 mana 2/2 regardless. But other than that, it's just a vanilla minion, and doesn't really synergize with any deck in particular. Grant Gargoyle, 5 mana 4/5, last words, summon an Earth Essence. I don't know that Earthright Runecraft really needs like a mid-game Earth Essence refresher. They seem to get along just fine with the ones they have already, Could be wrong. If you need more Earth Essence in your deck, this is on power curve, but otherwise a very unimpressive card. On Shadowcraft, Lord of the Flies. 7 mana 4/4. Fanfare, summon a Velocious Beetle, Virulent Hornet, or Vicious Scorpion. At the start of your turn, summon one of those as well. This is basically a 4/4 with Animal Companion attached. Also, this Animal Companion has 2 Huffers and a Misha. First we have Velocious Beetle, Huffer number 1, 4 mana 2/3 with Storm and Drain. Then we have Virulent Hornet, Huffer number 2, 4 mana 3/2 with Rush and Bane. And Vicious Scorpion, aka Misha, 4 mana 4/4 with Ward. So you do get about 7 mana's worth of stats over 2 bodies, plus the ability to do a little face damage, possibly remove something. This thing will give you extra value if it manages to summon more than 1 token, but that's probably not very likely. Overall, it's about what you expect out of a 7 mana card, although it is a little random. Interestingly enough, when you compare it to the 2 other 7 drops that Shadowcraft typically runs, it's kind of like a combination of both. Undead King is a 4/4 that summons 2 tokens when it dies. Lord of the Flies is a 4/4 that summons 1 token immediately. Cursed Soldier is sometimes played in more aggressive decks. It's a 5/4 that deals face damage, and Lord of the Flies has a token that can deal face damage. It's kind of like a midway point between those 2 cards. Overall, I think his text makes him seem a little more interesting than he is, but he should still be pretty useful. Bone Chimera, 3 mana 1/1. Last word, summon 2 skeletons. Another trade-off card with Skeleton Knight, a 3/1 that summons a skeleton when it dies. This one actually improves when it dies, whereas Skeleton Knight has its attack decreased when it dies, so your opponent is less likely to kill it unless they can deal with all 3 parts of it. And you do get 1 extra token, and it gets you 1 extra shadow, although it is a less aggressive card. So you might play Bone Chimera in a deck that has buffs since you're more likely to land on it. A more aggressive deck would probably prefer the 3/1. Basic trade-off card though. Andrus, 9 mana 5/9 with Bane, Necromancy 4, gain Storm. So kinda like Pluto, this card can be used for late game removal, but it can also be used for face damage, kind of like Temptress. And Necromancy 4 is pretty easy to pull off, so overall it should be a good card for a little late game burst damage if you need it. Dark Conjurer, 2 mana 2/2, Fanfare, summon a ghost if an evolved allied follower is in play. Another basic card with that mechanic. Deathbrand, 3 mana spell, destroy an enemy follower with 3 or less defense. Necromancy 4, destroy an enemy follower with 4 or more defense instead. This kind of lies halfway between Undying Resentment and Execution or Call of the Void. Although kind of a big negative point is that Necromancy is never optional. So if you have more than 4 Necromancy, you can't destroy anything with 3 or less defense with this card, which can be a big deal. If you're up against like Dragoncraft, and they drop an Imprisoned Dragon for example, and you really need to get through that ward, but you have more than 4 Necromancy at the time, you're not going to be able to use this card. Being able to destroy a really big minion for only 3 mana is tempting though. It's hard to say. Undying Resentment and Execution are going to be more reliable, but this one will get you better value sometimes. Spartoy Soldier, 3 mana 1/4, Ward, last words, gain 2 shadows. It's a pretty good stall card in a slower Shadowcraft deck. 1/4 is going to take 2 hits from like 2 2/2s or something. And the following turn you have Playful Necromancer to clean up, so doing that little chip damage to multiple minions is decent in Shadowcraft. And as a bonus you get extra shadows when it dies. Not bad. Malicious Ghost, 4 mana 4/2. Last words, give +2/+0 to a random allied follower. It might be alright in aggressive decks. On 4 mana you could evolve this, trade into something, and give +2/+0 to something that's already on the board ready to attack, making it basically removal plus a buff. Other than that, it's obviously not going to be good in a slower deck. Next up, Commander of Destruction, 5 mana 3/5, Ward, Necromancy 4, gain +2/+0. Pretty basic ward, but at 5 mana compared to the other new 5 drops, it pales in comparison. Unless you're a ward heavy stall deck or something, you're not really going to run this over the other 5 drops, that's a no-brainer. Swordcraft, Rogue's Creed, 3 mana amulet, at the start of your turn give +1/+1 to all allied followers with ambush. This just screams ambush deck. There's a decent amount of ambush minions to play with it, It gives you a guaranteed buff. It also stacks buffs if you can keep your minions on the board for multiple turns. The main question is, does it save Koga Kunoichi? It does help her dodge a lot of AoEs, bumping her up to 2 4/4s instead of 2 3/3s. She is still susceptible to certain ones though. Still not sure I would risk her even as 4/4s on turn 7, but it definitely gives her a lot more survivability. And some people would say this is why you don't review cards without seeing the whole set. To that I say, you people are boring. I'm sorry, but reviewing cards as you go is just fun. It's more fun that way. That's it. I don't need any other reason. If a card comes along that changes your view on a card, then so what? You get to review a card twice instead of once. It's more fun that way. Next up, Leonidas, 9 mana, 7/8. Last words. Summon a Leonidas' Resolve. Leonidas' Resolve is a 9 mana amulet. Whenever an allied follower comes into play, give it +3/+3 and rush. This is a hugely powerful amulet for the late game. It doesn't just buff swordcraft officers or commanders, it buffs anything you play. The main problem being that most swordcraft decks want to wrap up the game before this would have much of an effect, but it could open opportunities for later game swordcrafts. Overall, the stats good, the amulet's good, the effect is amazing. Could see play. Sword would prefer to hit face that late in the game, it just wants to wrap it up. So the rush doesn't help in that regard, but it also gives +3/+3, which is huge, and those minions that gain rush are probably going to stick around even if you have to hit minions with them instead of face. Gunnermaid Syria, 2 mana 2/2. If you evolve it, you gain +1/+1 if you have a commander in play. It's a conditional 2-drop evolve, which is kind of weird. And as usual, you don't put 2-drops in your deck expecting to evolve them. I'm not crazy about this one. Whole Souled Swing, 2 mana spell. If there are fewer allied followers than enemy followers in play, summon a knight and deal 2 damage to an enemy follower. And this is your basic 2 mana board control spell, but if you're behind on board, you get to summon a knight as well, which goes a little way towards a control-oriented swordcraft deck. Useful in a slower swordcraft deck. Ruthless Assassin, 3 mana 1/1 with Bane. Gain Storm if you have a commander in play. So it's basically a 3 mana assassinate, which has to obey ward as long as you have a commander in play. Again, this type of value removal would be pretty useful in a control-oriented swordcraft. So what we have now is the 2 mana damage spell, the efficient removal spell, quote spell, technically a minion, and Humpty Dumpty as AoE. So you got 3 basic control effects that you could put towards a control-oriented swordcraft deck. Although all those are conditional, so it would be subpar and any other class could do control better. Just saying, just putting it out there. Anyway, moving on. Mentos Teachings, 1 mana spell, give a follower +1/+0 until the end of turn, draw a card. Pretty useful spell. It's very basic, very obvious, but swordcraft tends to keep minions on the board. You also have ambush minions and some synergy with ambush minions now with Rogue's Creed. So you could put this in your deck just to cycle faster and give a little buff, which could help. Not bad. Not super amazing, but not bad. Swift Infiltrator, 3 mana 3/2. Fanfare gain +1/+0 and ambush if an evolved allied follower is in play. So it's another one of those cards you have to combo with an evolved allied follower. It's kind of awkward to play, but it gives ambush. If you want to try to put that in your ambush swordcraft deck, feel free. It's not badly statted, so I mean you're not losing much by including it. Niraj Defender, 4 mana 3/4, ward. Just a very basic vanilla ward. Nothing to really say about it, other than the fact that it comes in on turn 4, which is a highly competitive turn. You might as well just stick with Aurelia on turn 5. Assault Commander, 5 mana 4/4. Fanfare, give all allied officers +1/+0. So this is obviously a budget Wind God, but it does come with the trait Commander. Wind God herself is a bigger threat because she can buff the next turn if she's not dealt with. So it's a bit of a trade-off. Slightly below value compared to Wind God, but you are comparing bronze to gold. As a budget version of Wind God, it's not bad. And lastly, neutrals. Demonic Simulacrum, 2 mana 0/3, ward. Fanfare, gain +4/+2 when at least 2 evolved allied followers are in play. Wow. If you thought comboing stuff with one evolved allied follower was a pain, now you got a combo with 2 evolved allied followers. And that never happens. Basically, the only thing you can combo this with reliably is cards that activate evolve on other cards, like Neptune. You evolve Neptune and the Megalorca she summons also evolves. That gives you 2 evolved minions. Other than that, comboing this with anything is going to be a pipe dream. This kind of dream isn't going to happen very often. Surefire Bullet. 3 mana spell, deal 3 damage to an allied follower, deal 5 damage instead if it's evolved. It's a very interesting removal spell. 3 mana deal 3 damage is what you get with Demonic Strike, but you can't use this on face. Demonic Strike usually doesn't see play outside of aggressive decks that want the option of hitting face with it. Usually more control-ish decks have other forms of removal. So the value of dealing 5 damage for 3 mana is questionable, especially since it's conditional on the minion being evolved, which typically means it hit something already and is already weakened, so having a buffed spell doesn't always matter. I wouldn't be surprised to see people use it over other traditional forms of control spells, but the potential value is underwhelming, in my opinion. Dance of Death. 5 mana spell, destroy an enemy follower, deal 2 damage to the enemy leader. This is basically a more aggressive execution, which execution doesn't see play in aggressive decks, so I'm not seeing why someone would take that trade-off. A control deck would rather have the option of destroying an amulet as well, rather than dealing 2 damage to face. Overall, you want that flexibility. Raging Etin, 6 mana 4/5 with ward. Very basic minion, but it pays for the ward pretty heavily. If you actually look at the basic set, there are 6 wards, 3 bronze and 3 silver. The silver ones are the only ones that see play because the bronze ones pay for their ward with stats while the silver ones don't. And this is another one that falls in line with that theory of giving bronze basic wards a stat loss. So this one's not worth running. And lastly, Imperial Mammoth. 7 mana 6/7 vanilla minion, as basic as it gets. At 7 mana you want something doing more than just sitting there being a vanilla minion, so not gonna see play. Well, that wraps up the entire 109 card expansion review. Even though this video is going to go up after the expansion has already released, I still hope you found this informative and interesting. Thank you all very much for watching, and tune in again next time.